and very happy to celebrate, to welcome to this world, in a sense, a new book from Sebastian Schiermeister. The title of the book is, in English, Encounter in Strange Land, German-Hebrew Literary Entanglements in Palestine, Israel after 1933. It is a very rich and interesting book, and I'll allow, of course, our panelists to discuss it in more detail. I'll just set out the premise very generally. The question, to the degree I understand, is beautifully simple, and it is, what is the right context through which to understand German literature that was produced in Palestine and Israel since 1933? As Sebastian shows us, there are multiple directions that scholars took in the past to try to understand this literature, but really, and I think this is where the book makes a powerful argument, really the best way to understand this literature is in the context of the literary works in which it was created, that is what is known as Israeli or Hebrew literature. So really the project of the book is to map out and to think about the German literature that was created in Israeli, in Hebrew, in the context of Hebrew literature, of Safut Ivrit. And I'm sure our speakers will discuss it in greater detail. The book is rich and interesting and complex, so I'll leave it at that. I'll just say one more word of introduction, and that is the pandemic that we're living through is a terrible thing. The fact that we cannot meet in person is terrible. However, it allows us the wonderful opportunity to have speakers that come from, well, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Hamburg, Washington, D.C., and Chicago, which is not easy to produce otherwise. So I hope we'll enjoy that fact at least, and hopefully we'll get to meet soon in Jerusalem and celebrate in person this wonderful book or some other event. I'll introduce each speaker, and then we'll hear a short talk, and then Sebastian will get the chance to respond and to say a few words about the book and the occasion, and hopefully we'll have another 10 minutes to discuss what we learned. So our first speaker is Michael Brenner. Professor Michael Brenner is the Seymour and Lillian Absent Chair in Israel Studies and the Director for the Center of Israel Studies at American University at Washington, D.C. He also holds the chair of Jewish History and Culture at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and serves as International President of the Leo Baeck Institute for the Study of German Jewish History. He chairs the Academic Advisory Board of the Franz Rosenzweig Center at the Hebrew University. In 2020, he was the first recipient of the first Salo-Baron Award for Scholarly Excellence in Research of the Jewish Experience. He has published widely, and I think we all benefited immensely from his work. I certainly did on German Jewish history and on Israel. His latest publication is In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution and the Rise of Nazism, which is forthcoming from Princeton University. Oh, that's an exciting title. Okay, it's not yet out, is it?
It's out in German.
Okay, I didn't know this. Okay, so it's coming out in English in Princeton shortly. Michael Brenner, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Amir. And yes, I remember the last time we ran into each other in the streets of Jerusalem. I'm sorry we're so far apart now. It is really a pleasure and an honor for me to share this remote panel with all of you and to discuss Sebastian's book. So thank you for having me. Sebastian Schiermeister's book begins actually in Jerusalem in Rehov Bialik. And as he writes in the book, it is a house with many memories. For me personally, it also brought back many of my own memories living in the Jerusalem of the 1980s. I believe it was actually in Rehov Bialik or around there where I had a lovely dinner in the house of Gershon Shaked and his wife discussing Joseph Roth and Franz Kafka. I remember watching an almost magical performance of Agnon's Ido Be'enam in the Khan Theater, Jerusalem, I remember the dark apartment of Shalom Ben Chorin behind the old Tachana Merkazit and his dark voice with a strong Bavarian accent in his Hebrew when accompanying the sounds of the harf at Bet El Synagogue on Rehov Shmuel HaNagid, right next to where I lived. I also remember one of the last German writing emigrants, Werner Kraft, telling stories about Benjamin and Sholem. And let me also mention all the memories that came back when I read the book. I vividly remember a class I took then with Ita Shedletsky on German Jewish writing, focusing mainly on Gustav Krojanker's Juden in der deutschen Literatur. All of those names appear in Sebastian Schirmeister's wonderful book, which I would rather call a treasure chest containing and preserving the treasure of an impossible literature in a way, of texts that should not exist, of a literature facing substantial ideological resistance, a big magical lost treasure in a klitzekleinem Land, in Arzeno Aktantonet. This book is not just a memorial or an homage to a lost culture, it is indeed a treasure in itself, beautifully written, and opening so many paths of thought. It is a book about the merits of Dafka, as Sebastian writes in the book, about minor literature, and of course about German texts written by Jewish authors in Mandate Palestine and the early state of Israel, and about their frustration not to be able to express themselves in what they consider to be their native language, Hebrew, which was not their native language. They expressed this struggle in different ways. And it goes back even before the time of his book. Long before living in Jerusalem himself, Martin Buber delivered a speech at the first major Hebrew language Congress in Berlin in December of 1909 in German. He voiced his regret that, quote, I have to speak about the Hebrew language in a foreign tongue, as I am not able to think in the Hebrew language, and I do not want to translate my thoughts, which are thought in the foreign language, into my own but less known language. Now that's complicated. Note that for Buber, German was the foreign language, and Hebrew, what he called his own language, but he could not express himself in his own language. Strange as that may seem, Buber was definitely not alone among German-speaking Jews who viewed Hebrew as their own language, even if they couldn't speak it. The literary critic Alfred Kerr raved about a Hebrew performance of Richard Baer Hoffmann, the Viennese playwright, about his play, Jacob's Dream, in the 1920s Berlin. And Baer Hoffmann himself thought that the Habima production of his German play in Hebrew translation was even more genuine than the German original written by himself. Expressionist, maybe that was the most notable and eccentric example for this, was the German expressionist poet Else Lasker-Schüler. Her own imagination did not only make her sign letters as Prince Yusuf of Thebes, Prince Yusuf von Theben, painting herself in Oriental clothes, but also convinced her that she was a Hebrew poet. And one of her most famous collections of poetry was actually her Hebrew ballads, Hebräische Balladen, written, of course, in German. Lasker-Schüler's identification with the characters of the Hebrew Bible culminated in her conviction that actually her language was Hebrew and not German. And when the Hebrew poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg offered to translate some of Lasker-Schüler's poems into Hebrew, she replied angrily, "What? But I am writing in Hebrew." Greenberg, who lived in Berlin in 1922 and 23, remained an admirer of Lasker-Schüler, and in the end, he seemed convinced of her statement. The non-Hebrew reader, he wrote about one of her poems in the Hebrew paper Davar, will find original Hebrew in her poem, Living Hebrew of the 20th century. Well, ironically, and maybe tragically, a few years later, Lasker Schüler had to leave Germany and finally settled in Palestine, where she was not able to communicate in Hebrew. Martin Buber wanted to speak Hebrew in front of a Hebrew Congress, but was not able to do so. Richard Beer-Hoffmann felt a part of him in the Hebrew translation of his play, which he could not understand. And Else Lasker Schüler fantasized that she wrote Hebrew melodies in a language foreign to her. They all conceived of Hebrew as a language that was genuinely Jewish, a part of them even if they did not understand it. And what tragic irony lay in the words of the Nazi students of 1933, who demanded that, quote, Jewish books appear in Hebrew language. If they appear in German, they have to be marked as translation. Did German Jews who made Aliyah in the 1930s and kept writing in German then write in translation? Well, of course not. But like the Nazi students of 1933, and of course for very different reasons, the society in which they now lived also demanded that they would write in Hebrew. Arnold Zweig had to experience physical violence when the offices of his journal, in German, Der Orient, went up in flames. Eugen Höflich encountered only verbal threats when he continued to write in German, although somewhat ironically, he had changed his name to the Hebrew Ben-Gavriêl. The most successful among them all, Max Brod, was actually awarded the Bialik Prize by the city of Tel Aviv, but came under attack as this prestigious prize was meant for Hebrew writers, which he definitely was not, no matter how much he desired to be one. In the vein of Richard Beer-Hoffmann and Else Lasker Schüler, he had once written, I was 30 years old before I began to learn the language of my people. It seemed to me as if for 30 years I had been deaf. So was Israel exile or home for those writers? Only for a few among them, most prominently Arnold Zweig, it was an exile from which they returned home to Germany as fast as they could. They returned to what Amos Oz called a makom acher, a different place, another place. Almost all of them knew that there was no makom acher, as Gershon Shaked phrased it in his review of Amos Oz's early novel. They stayed, fulfilling their longing for a distant love, a concept perhaps best expressed by Max Brod in his novel Unambo, torn between and deterritorialization. They found in Israel a peculiar cultural location, to perhaps misuse an expression Robert Alter applied for the place of Hebrew in Sholem, Benjamin, and Kafka. These German Jewish writers, these German writers in Palestine, Israel, lived in two worlds, writing in German, but aspiring for belonging in the new Hebrew state, and thus often creating a language that included both, as Mark Gelber observed in his writing on Brod's Unambo and quoted in Sebastian Schirmeister's book. Although the novel is written in German, transliterated Hebrew words comprise a significant portion of the text's working vocabulary, and the particular meanings of the Hebrew lexical items are discussed as a rule in lengthy explanations and digressions. And Sebastian Schirmeister points to more than 150 places in this relatively short novel containing transcribed Hebrew words in the German, in Brod's very own transcription, basically on every second page. Well, come to a conclusion, maybe all of these writers actually remembered a passage in Herzl's Judenstaat that gave them hope that they could continue feeling comfortable in their native languages and their little habits. It reads as follows. That's from Herzl, Judenstadt, is a reference to the little habits and comforts of the ordinary man in keeping with the serious nature of this pamphlet? I think it is in keeping, and moreover, very important. For these little habits are the 1,001 fine, delicate threads which together go to make up an unbreakable rope. Here, certain limited notions must be set aside. Whoever has seen anything of the world knows that just these little daily customs can easily be transplanted everywhere. There are English hotels in Egypt and on the mountain crest in Switzerland, Vienna cafes in South Africa, French theaters in Russia, German operas in America, and best Bavarian beer in Paris. When we journey out of Egypt again, we shall not leave the flesh pots behind. Every man will find his customs again in the local groups, but they will be better, more beautiful, and more agreeable than before. And of course, as we know, Herzl thought that among the languages spoken there, German would have a prominent role. Sebastian Schirmeister's masterful book is not only a big contribution to the little habit of writing in your own language, in a little country, Artsenu Aktantonet, but also to our occupation with a little literature, to our study of minor literatures in the vein of Gilles Deleuze's and Félix Guattari's Littérature mineure. And congratulations again to the publication.
Thank you very much, Michel. I think after we're done, we can all go have a drink for little habits. I think I'll adopt that. It's a wonderful phrase. Our next speaker is Naama Rokem. She is an associate professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of Chicago, where she's also the director of the Joyce Z. and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. Her book, Prosaic Conditions, Heinrich Heine and the Spaces of Zionist Literature, was published in 2013, and she is currently completing a second book about the networks of correspondence and language mixing between German and Hebrew, with chapters on Kafka, Alaska Schuller, Amichai, Celan, Aaron Sholem, Pagis, and Rubner. Before I allow her to speak, I'll just say that when I encountered her name in Sebastian's book, my heart kind of leaped, because I was like, oh, I know Naama. It's wonderful. It's a nice tribute. Naama, floor is yours.
Thank you, Amir, and thank you, Sebastian, for giving us the occasion to get together and discuss, and for this study, which is, as I agree fully with Misha, both masterful and a real treasure chest. It's also incredibly generous in how sort of it shares all of this work. You've gone kind of studied thoroughly and collected all this rich information and shared very, very generously in this under the covers of this book. It's also, I found it, I was trying to look for a good way to express sort of the feeling that I had reading it. It's incredibly subtle, right? And goes through a series of subtle moves and very self-conscious in how it presents a history and self-critical of the very operation of constructing a narrative of this complex reality, of this complex historical context that it looks at. So it's and on top of all of that, it's just really a pleasure to read. It's very well written and reads sort of in some senses like right. There are the kind of characters who show up and come back again later, and things are connected in ways that really kind of keep you at the edge of your seat. So I warmly recommend it to all of you. So it's an incredible pleasure to be discussing it, and yet quite challenging because of all of this richness and this subtlety. And I guess following Michel, who gave us kind of a sense of some of this sort of the density of this fabric and its richness, I'm trying in my comments to kind of hover a little bit more, sort of understand kind of the conceptual framing of the whole project. So our talks complement each other well in that sense. And And in some sense, so I have two main kind of comment questions. I guess under the rubric of first kind of this issue of the German-Hebrew contact zone, where as you heard, I also sort of make my intellectual home these days. So first, a question that has to do with this kind of German-Hebrew contact zone as Sebastian kind of configures it for us, or reconfigures and describes it to us. And then the second would be sort of more broadly about the question of the archive and the archives that you're working with, and how you, the archive that you create in some sense in this project. And in both cases, I guess I'm trying to think through precisely the scope of the project and its shape and its limits, or kind of the territory, right? Which again, it's a challenging thought operation, precisely because the book is constructed by pushing back against any idea of it begins by describing itself as a fragment, right, as not something whole and complete, and thereby sort of disabuses us right from the start, from the notion that it has clear limits and a clear scope. And it also works very elegantly with a kind of model of a literary history that is anti-narrative, incomplete, fragmented, using the model of David Welbury's kind of new history of German literature. But there are other similar projects, right, who kind of focus on particular dates as these kind of metonymical representations in lieu of and against any notion of a coherent narrative. So it's a fool's errand, but I'm going to pursue it by way of as an invitation to a conversation. So I guess I was reflecting back sort of when I was explaining to a friend yesterday what it was that I was going to do this morning. I said, oh, it's a book about German literature written in Palestine and in Israel, right? And that's a shorthand that I think comes easy to hand, and it's kind of in the limits of that shorthand that I think something really interesting happens, right? So if the book deals with German literature written in Palestine and in the state of Israel, then it's nevertheless an endeavor that Sebastian frames from the outset as comparatist by nature, and he does so by contrasting between the field that he's surveying and any kind of traditional conception of the field of a national literature, right? And its national model, as Sebastian reminds us, literary studies has followed a kind of Herderian vision of a one-to-one correlation between a territory, a people, a language, and a culture. And in some sense, in this case, a territory has been mixed with another language, right? That's sort of what one territory has been mixed with the wrong language, as it were. And that's one way of thinking of what Sebastian is doing, is kind of looking at what happens in that clash. So in that sense, the project is a kind of both the literature that is studied here and the project of examining it are proposed as kind of antidote to nationalist thinking, right? Pushing back both against a German nationalism that has often posited precisely this homogeneity between territory, folk, and language by excluding Jews, and against the normalizing impulse of Jewish nationalism, which strives to create, right, a monolingual Jewish state after that same model, with Hebrew literature as a kind of proof of concept, and therefore the field of Hebrew literary studies as the kind of ultimate telos of the whole project. So if that's the kind of how we're thinking about Sebastian's project, then we can imagine it as a kind of switching out, right? I was imagining it's sort of like these children's books that have characters in different costumes divided into 3 panels that you can switch between, right? And that the literary scene that Sebastian is describing is kind of like a torso in a suit with legs in the swimsuit that we've switched out. And it's that kind of imbalance or clash, the wrong language in the right place, or the right language in the wrong place, or something like that. But that, in some sense, the whole point is that this is not a good metaphor for it, and that's not how it works. And I was looking again at the title of your book. In some sense, it almost in itself encapsulates, as much as you're against neat narratives, it feels like the title gives us a little narrative. You begin with a concept of encounter and end up with entanglement, right? And that even just thinking about the German writers within this Zionist context, it is a story. We kind of follow you as well as you kind of encounter also the Hebrew context and then get entangled in it, and it's a kind of snowball effect of more and more comparative, dialogic, interlingual. So in some sense, I'm sort of groping for a better metaphor than this: the torso in a suit and the legs in a swimsuit. And yeah, I'm trying to think through this narrative of from encounter to entanglement, and the way that kind of narratives of movement and of travel and is one kind of very powerful theme or kind of red thread that you follow, right? That by definition, that's one way in which thinking through this literature that refuses to stay in one territory, refuses to stay in one language, requires us to kind of think in movement. And I think it's also this kind of it's a travel journey, but it's also an attempt to look at one thing, one text, for example, that moves between languages as a sort of almost, training your microscope on an electron or something that will refuses to stay in place, right? And that dynamism is something that, to me, that the book gave a really kind of powerful and thought-provoking window into. So I really want to end that kind of with a question mark, both, I guess, as an invitation, Sebastian, for you to tell us a bit more about the process, kind of whether my sense of that you started out as a Germanist and then got entangled, if you want to tell us more about that and what that has meant for your project. So as I mentioned, the second concept that I wanted to focus on is sort of the archive. And it seemed to me that there are two intertwined senses in which this book is archival, right? It takes upon itself to construct an archive. It gives readers access to an archive, and makes kind of the archival an object of discussion. And as I said, in two different senses. So to formulate this again as a question, I'd be really curious to hear more from you, Sebastian, about how you thought about the relationship between these two senses. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, you're resurrecting a body of published literature that's been largely forgotten, right? And you're reading these texts that are largely unread, and that in itself is a kind of powerful something that you a service that you render in some sense, reminding us of these books, and telling us about them. One doesn't have to read through all of Max Brod's novels because we get kind of an overview from you. But there's, I think there's something much more serious at stake, right? Is also kind of pointing out the way that they are unread and thinking about what it means to read them. And in that sense, it really made kind of reading your book made me think again about sort of you're dealing with what Margaret Cohen around 2000 called the great unread. And then other scholars like Franco Moretti took the term up, and there was this whole sort of, in the early 2000s, a lively discussion around the idea of the great unread. Of course, Cohen and others who were involved in that conversation were thinking, first of all, about British and French literature, and the pathos, in some sense, of the term, the great unread, comes from the realization that the way that Cohen describes it, right? No single human, no literary scholar, no matter how diligent they are, how fast reading they are, would ever encompass everything that was published in a single decade, even probably in a single year in Victorian England, say, right? That there's just this kind of a continent of to be discovered, the great unread. And that brings about kind of discussions that you mentioned, you allude to, the kind of notion of distant reading, of thinking about genre as one organizing principle for approaching this great unread. And of course, in that discussion, there are basic premises at work about how and why certain works get canonized and others are forgotten, why we read, I don't know, Dickens and the Bronte sisters, but not so much many other contemporary female authors, or not the more popular lowbrow genres, not sea adventures so much as kind of Bildungsromane, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, unlike Margaret Cohen and her colleagues, we're dealing here with a small literature, and something that you really sort of thematize beautifully, right? Starting with this notion of Atsenu Aktantonet that Michael has alluded to. So the pathos is, in your case, of unveiling the unread works a little bit differently, right? You're not so much a discoverer of continents as maybe, opening a treasure chest. Scale matters, right? And it seems, reading the book, that you have achieved the humanly impossible and read all of the literature written by German speakers within the orbit of territorial Zionism between about 1930 and 1980. And again, truly no small feat, given that this is a field inhabited by more than one graphomaniac, it seems like. So on the one hand, kind of the small literature does allow you a kind of giving us a full survey in some sense. But then there's and this brings me to the kind of the second sense of the archive that I want to get to. There's also just a lot of unpublished material that you deal with and survey and describe. So indeed, while the book does offer comprehensive lists and catalogs, and it offers us a kind of suggestion of surveying, giving us a kind of surveying view of the whole field, Schirmeister ends up putting his money, in some sense, on close reading as the preferred approach for redeeming these unread works. It's sort of like you can't get away only drawing the map. You really have to ultimately, in order to perform this redemption, to give us this great unread, we end up kind of spending time close reading, and the book ends with a series of close readings of 5 books that belong to this field, and that in itself is kind of makes a strong argument about what the unread is and how one might kind of reproduce the archive of it. But to me, all of this raises all the more acutely the question of why and how these texts ended up being largely forgotten. And I understand your gesture of not only reading them, but also giving them precisely a kind of philological attention, right? This loving gaze of close reading as a refusal of the question of quality, right? It's not about whether these are good novels or bad novels. Were they forgotten because they're not that great? So I won't ask that question. I think you kind of categorically exclude that question. So I won't ask it here either, even though I just did in so many words. But I would love to hear you talk more about this question, which you touch on in several ways and in several places in the book, of why these works were marginalized. And again, it seems to me one answer would have to do precisely with the torso in the suit and the legs in the swimsuit, that they don't fit neatly into any of our existing categories and so on. But in another sense, the thing that became more and more striking to me as I read the book was how within the dynamics of Zionism and Israeli culture, this group of Ashkenazi men are hardly the silenced margins of society, right? That they even though, right, they weren't quite as recognized as they wanted to, they didn't have some of what they were trying to achieve didn't succeed. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with people who were kind of very much at the heart of what was valorized, of what was considered high culture, where one expected to find high culture. So again, the pathos of redeeming them comes with a kind of ironic twist, which I think you very kind of consciously, you put us in the position of dealing with it. And this is also how I understood. I tried to kind of reason and understand your choice to end the series with a close reading of Amos Oz, right? The 5 books that you read at the end of your study. who, though he has posthumously become a topic of some debate recently, really you can't get more kind of quintessentially representative of hegemonic consensus in Israeli culture, right? So the narrative leads us to Amos Oz, and that really, to me, brought to the surface in a very powerful way precisely this question: what is the margin? What is the center? What does it mean to recover in this context? So I read that move, your choice to position his first novel as the final in your series of close readings as a kind of polemical move almost in relation to this question of canonization and marginalization and the unread. But on some level, I have to admit, I don't fully understand that move. So I also very much invite you to unpack it for us more. But then, so I've gone on at length about the first sense of the archive, but finally, kind of, to me, a very thought-provoking aspect of the way that this book handles this question of the archive and invites us into an archive is also the kind of how you navigate between published and largely unread materials, and then various sort of unpublished manuscripts of novels, letters, kind of the archival work. And so I felt to give kind of our audience a sense of the book, it's really important to mention that, right? That you've done all of this work of reading through correspondences and notes and I'm missing the word tiutot, drafts of translations and so on. And I think that in itself also illuminates, right, that what ends up being printed and where and how the kind of being lost and found in translation, as you elegantly describes it, is also a facet of your very subtle kind of delineation of a field while being kind of skeptical of the possibility of delineating a field. And I'll end with that. Thank you again. It really was a joy to read, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Naama. Our last speaker, before we turn to hear Sebastian, who has his a plate already quite full, is Guido Tikwatsky, who I'm very happy to say is associate professor in the Department of Hebrew Literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research focuses on the canon of modern Hebrew literature, both on its own and in dialogue with European culture, and he combines in his work digital humanities methods and archival work. Guido, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amir, and thank you, Sebastian, for this beautiful and I would also say brave book. And when I say brave, I refer to this, the way you challenge paradigms in the research of Hebrew literature, the way you problematize the way Gershon Shaked used to read most of Hebrew literature as complying or non-complying to the Zionist master narrative, or challenging Dan Miron's continuity, the way he tries to conceive Hebrew literature or Hebrew Jewish literature as based on fractions instead of kind of a continuum, and you challenge these paradigms with the tool of German-Jewish dialogue, while you also ask many questions about these specific tools. So it's kind of a Houdini magic. You unlock yourself in the beginning of the book, and you lock yourself, and then you unlock yourself. And at the end, it makes us all rethink the history and the historiography of Hebrew literature as well as Jewish literature. And it also enables us to imagine kind of a German literature in Israel, kind of a German ecosystem that used to exist here. And by that, I couldn't avoid from thinking while reading your book that this is actually a book about the formation of modern Hebrew literature. You speak about German authors, but it's actually talking about the Hebrew literature, and the German works are kind of the road not taken of this local culture. In that, you place some new milestones that we should all now regard them while speaking about the history of Hebrew literature. For example, is 1939 the year of World War II, when World War II broke, is indeed the end of what may be called the European era of Hebrew literature. You show us that there is German Jewish literature written here. So this is kind of a European literature written here in Mediterranean Palestine. And instead you bring us a new landmark, the year of 1941. And I would like to focus on one of the chapters that is around that year, a year when two anthologies of German Jewish works were published in Palestine. You generously told me about these two anthologies that I didn't know about them several years ago. And the two are actually giving us kind of a picture of how German Jewish literature and Hebrew literature looked like in a very specific, a unique perspective in that year. And I would like to share with you a very short presentation I prepared. Here it is. So this is the first anthology, the Ernte, and the other one, as you told us here in this book, is called Ariel. Both, I say again, were published in 1941. And I would like to focus on a specific excerpt in this anthology, Ariel, written by Leah Goldberg. And I considered it, following your discussion in the book, as a very showing or telling example, because it's saying some new things about the time and the place. So this is actually the work that opens this anthology. The title is So klang Paris. And I would share with you this translation I made. It's taken from a novel Leah Goldberg published some 4 years before the anthology was published. And the novel is called Letters from an Imaginary Voyage. We all know it. And this is how it reads in English, the same excerpt we saw then just a moment ago in German. So just hope that now you can see that well. Paris is not Paris for me, says the locutor, anymore, and I'm afraid that the time is too short for me to fall in love with her. Actually, I'm here only for the last day and 2 nights, so I haven't seen almost nothing. Haven't seen, but did heard. There is a special music in the hustle bustle of cities, like a huge elementary school, where a visitor is astonished and asks, how can one live in such a noise? While those living within it don't even pay attention to the noise. What does the finale of the city's symphony, yet to be written, would prophesize? Is it the end, or rather, a new beginning, even more horrible. Symphony number 10 of the 20th century. Now, you can very clearly see how the text that was written before World War II is read completely differently when we see that in this anthology in 1941, and the timeline, the original timeline of the text, the letter in this epistolary novel was in reality, or maybe only just for the sake of the novel, was written in 1934. Then the publication of the letter in the book of Goldberg in 1977, and then in Ariel after World War II broke. And as it now rearranges the time or makes some disorder, so are the places. Goldberg writes about Paris when she is at Kovno, Lithuania, shortly after being to Berlin. She publishes this text while being in Tel Aviv, and when the editors of Ariel republish this text, their eyes are actually, because of translating this text into German, are looking back to Berlin. So I think that this excerpt takes us to the very complex dialogue that you show us in the book about time and space, and how many assumptions that we made about Hebrew literature should be now be discussed again. And I would like to conclude with another thing that I learned from your research, and that is another paradigm that you challenge. This very known distinction that is identified with Dan Miron between the Hebrew Eretz Israeli modernism, the local modernism, and the modernism of Hebrew writers in Europe, a modernism chutz la'aretzi, as Miron puts it. And by showing us all this rich ecosystem of German writing in Eretz Israel, in and outside Israeli literature, you also kind of breaking this dichotomy between those two modernisms. And I think that after reading your book, we all have to reconsider the history of Hebrew literature, not only German literature. So many thanks, dear Sebastian.
Okay. Thank you very much, Guido, for these remarks. And now we turn to our Chatana Simcha, to Sebastian Schiermeister, to hear from him. I'll just introduce you very briefly, and we still have some time, so it would be very nice if we can hear from you a little bit about the conception of the book, and I'm sure you would like to engage with all the comments and questions that were raised, and hopefully we'll have also even a little time to get some questions from our participants in the seminar. So that would be nice. So Sebastian Schiermeister finished his PhD at the University of Hamburg in 2017. During the time he was a PhD student, he was also a visiting scholar at the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center here at the Hebrew University. He was also a Moritz Stern postdoc fellow for modern Jewish studies at the Lichtenberg College in Göttingen, and now he's Amos Oz professor for Hebrew literature at the University of Munich. His book, about which you've just heard, was published in 2019, so last year. Sebastian, it's great to have you here. The floor is yours.
All right, and right on time, I think my internet connection is failing. But I hope you can you hear me?
We hear you.
It's a bit difficult. My daughter is throwing a tantrum behind the door because I'm not available. And the internet connection is failing, but okay. So I'll try my best. First of all, thank you. Thank you, the four of you, for devoting your time to this event, for spending the time reading the book. Thank you to the Lübeck Institute and the Rosenzweig Center for organizing this launch, which, as Amir said, comes like 2 years too late, or with a delay of 2 years. And yeah, in a way, I owe gratitude to a lot of people who were relevant for the development of this book, for the course of this study. First of all, obviously my PhD advisor, Dörte Bischoff, who unconditionally supported me and let me run wild in this field. So I could make all the mistakes myself, and I'm completely responsible for the results. And who also included the book in this as a first volume in this new series, Exilkulturen. And in a way, I also owe a debt of gratitude to Dandine and Yoav Rinon, who thought I was wasting my time with a bunch of insignificant authors, and explicitly said so after a 5-minute presentation at the Rosenzweig Center in 2014. I think Guido remembers, he comforted me afterwards. So in a way, proving them wrong was a major motivation for this project. And so I'm really grateful for everyone who voluntarily contributed to the book. And so I offer the traditional blessing of the Guild of German Hebrew Scholars to Danke. Nama already knows that one. So I'll try to respond to those very rich comments. Thank you, Michael Brenner, for this wonderful summary of the book. I don't know why it took me 250 pages. There was very, very concise and precise. I really enjoyed hearing it. Your way of condensing my thoughts. And as Nama asked, I want to say a few words about how this whole project came about, or how my journey developed over time. And in fact, when I started out writing the dissertation, I was already entangled in this German-Hebrew complex encounter, dialogue, whatever you want to call it, because I already wrote my MA thesis on a topic exactly in this field. So I was already tainted in a way. But I was at the German department in Hamburg. And so I indeed started off as a German Germanist, as a German scholar in the field of exile studies. So this was the point of departure. And as we already heard from your wonderful comments, exile is one of the crucial points of this whole constellation, because home and exile are two categories that kind of mix with each other, blur into each other if we're talking about migration from Nazi Germany to Palestine, because it's an exile in a sense, and it's also a homecoming in another sense, and you can't really disentangle these two narratives. So I was curious how literature that was written right within this this intricate situation responded to this entanglement. There's a wonderful quote by Shalom Ben-Gavriêl, whom Michael already mentioned, who wrote in the beginning of the 60s, and I quote, "Home and exile, something unique happened here. We who were forced into exile found home, and for others, the homeland of their people turned into exile. And those who returned had to realize that Germany, the home of their youth, had become exile because Israel had already become their home. The boundaries become blurred." So from these blurred boundaries, I started, and as I described in one of the early chapters of the book, there was existing research on the topic, limited and somewhat problematic research. So I tried to navigate somehow to another place, conceptually and theoretically. So I used this very open concept of Dan Miron to think about Jewish literatures as a complex that allows an infinite number of paths to be taken when reading within this literature, within this complex. And to shift the focus from the traditional German-Jewish symbiosis, this is how the texts were usually read, so from their point of departure, looking at Germany, to the German-Hebrew encounters. So what happens in Israel or in Palestine at the time these authors arrive and continue to write in German. And the third strategy, if you wish, was to go to the archives, and do some digging. And as anyone who has been to the archives and spent time, days, weeks, months, for example, in the archive department of the National Library in Jerusalem, knows very well, archival research and archaeology have a lot in common. There's a lot of sand and dirt to be moved away before you can find the treasures. And sometimes you don't find treasures at all. And so all you're left with is the dirt. But coming from a family of geologists, I know that sometimes it's the dirt that can actually tell you most about the past. So I got my hands dirty, to stay in the metaphor, and looked also not only for treasures, but also at everything that was in the archive in between. And as Nama noted, I really liked to share these findings because it's an enormous investment of time. And you can tell stories you can't tell from published materials. So you find connections between authors. You can tell, as I tried in these close reading chapters, you can tell stories of how texts came to be published, how they were transformed in translation, how these are all small stories. You know, this is something that you can find in the archives. And obviously I thought a lot about the pathos of the archive in terms of Elida Assmann, who when she writes about the great unread, or all that is in the archive, all the forgotten materials that are there but no one knows about them, uses crazy metaphors with a lot of pathos. And I tried, I hope successfully, I tried to avoid this pathos, to not, scream, as was very common in German exile studies, to scream out, "Oh, I found an unjustly forgotten author. We have to remember him." And frankly, most of the texts do not justify this outburst. And this is another point that Nama mentioned, the question of quality. So I read a lot of horrible texts. I read, as Kafka put it in his diary notes on minor literature, eine im Einzelnen schlechte Literatur. So literature that is bad in its individual manifestation. But still, I am convinced, and this is one of the methodological or disciplinary arguments of the book, that these texts want to be literature. That's what they tell us. They want to be literature, so they should be read as literature. And literary studies provide all the necessary tools to read a text that might not match certain standards in aesthetic terms, to still read them as literature and come to conclusions and try to find something that Erich Auerbach called Strahlkraft. So you take a single phenomenon and look at it in a way that it sheds light on larger questions, on larger phenomena. Questions like, how do we conceptualize Jewish literatures? What is the value of translation with relation to national literatures? How is migration narrated in different historical circumstances? What can the archive tell us about processes of selection and canonization? And one of the central questions which I took in a way from Sidra de Korven-Ezrachi, who's I think also in the audience, why is ultimate arrival such a danger for the literary imagination? So why do these texts avoid arrival at all costs? Why do they continue their stories? Why do they set their protagonists on the road again and again and again, despite the fact that the Zionist master narrative promises arrival and salvation? And how is this connected, or what does this have to do with the inherent quality of literature? Not just Jewish literature, but literature in general, which just wants to be continued, like Scheherazade, just wants to live by suspending the endings, by continuing the story, by going on. And this was one of the reasons I included Amos Oz, also because he has his first novel is a pretty nice example for what happens if you end with the ultimate arrival, because it's a complete stop of everything, of movement, of narrative, of relations. All that remains is a picture, a static picture. This is what the last chapter of Makom Ocher is called, the last picture, or the last image. So I was very intrigued by your reading, Nama, of this constellation of these five close readings I did, putting Amos Oz at the end. As you all know, the text is usually much smarter than the author. I wasn't aware of its polemic potential, I have to admit. It was merely a matter of chronology and a matter of the need to select. I had a number of other texts that I, for years, thought I would include. For example, Lea Goldberg's Michtavim Nesiya Meduma, the Letters from an Imaginary Journey, a text I greatly admire. And eventually I didn't include it, and I'm glad, because there's another very nice book by Natasha Gordinsky written on this novel. And there were other texts by Jenny Aloni, for example, and by other authors that I considered and then kind of threw out because I had the thing had to be finished. And so I was left with these 5 texts, and I was hoping that in addition to my own readings and thoughts on these texts, that maybe in their constellation, in this somewhat arbitrary combination, they would bring about new meanings, new questions, because this is, and here I'm coming to what Gideon commented on, the idea or the possibilities of the anthology, which is basically combining texts that have maybe nothing to do with each other, but you put them next to each other and suddenly there is a connection just by putting them between two book covers. And you start thinking how they are connected, how you get from one text to the next, and what happens at this place of contiguity of encounter where these two texts or more texts meet in an anthology. And somehow thought this is one way of solving these problems that Nama so astutely described. On the one hand, being very specific with examples and materials. On the other hand, trying to challenge paradigms and traditions in scholarship, without just telling another great story or another great narrative, just to tell that everyone before me was wrong and I now found the solution, but to stay with my scruples that I had from the very start and that I think are still there in the book. Maybe we should just enter into the conversation. I'm sure I haven't managed to respond to all your rich comments, but maybe you could pose a question again if I haven't addressed it yet, or so I'd really like this feels like, we all know each other one way or the other, so this feels it's not only nice that everyone's talking about my book, but it also feels like kind of a high school reunion, and this is a very, very nice encounter to stay with one of the central terms of my study.
The floor is open, and I think if anybody from the audience would like to pose a question, they can do so on the chat, or I think they can do it on Facebook, and yeah, it will help us transmit the question if necessary.
There were a couple of comments from Sidra, I think, but this is that's just about the language. This is conducted. I mean, it's one of the tricky things of this whole German-Hebrew studies endeavor, that it's usually happening in English, which comes with its own set of problems and limitations mainly. So there was one of the considerations when writing the book, or when turning the dissertation into the book. How do I translate everything? Do I include Hebrew? How do I account for the fact that this all happens between languages? And so this is also why in the end the German-Hebrew dictionary, I have it here. It's my very personal. Actually, it's my wife's copy that she got when we were both volunteers in Israel. So this is kind of an encapsulation of this whole setting. This book addresses the need to, or the urge, or the demand to speak Hebrew and write in Hebrew, and also the promise of translatability, that you can just take one word and put it in the other language, and then you somehow get across to the other culture and to the other literary system. And obviously it doesn't work that way. And also if you look at the cover of the book and you look at the page, there are all these funny words that have nothing in common besides the fact that their Hebrew counterparts all start with the same letter. So you have another nice way of visualizing the idea of the anthology, and also of just this kind of arbitrary order of things.
Nama wants to say something?
I mean, I was just in response to that directly going to say that the presence of Hebrew in your book and the way that you even just kind of typographically make the Hebrew present in your German scholarship is one aspect of the book that I found kind of a kind of performance that I thought was really important, really significant, and worthy of just pointing out and pausing for a second, because even sort of for readers of I don't know, within the kind of German philological, very serious tradition of printing, editions, and books, Hebrew so often is a kind of blind spot, right? Even say in editions of Celan, the Hebrew will end up being printed in mirror script, right? Just these even just small, silly mistakes, but it's a kind of deeply seated just inability to a hurdle that somehow the scholarship can't quite ultimately get over. And so I saw even just in that, both your kind of your code switching, right? The using Dafka and as a kind of gesture and kind of evoking and making present some of what the book is about, but also doing something very significant that it felt to me within a kind of, as a German scholarly book, to really put the Dafka there, right? Its own measure of Dafka on that level as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons I had to do the layout myself. I think the publishing house would have lynched me if I asked them to do this change of directions every other paragraph. But for me, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is kind of a statement. I wanted to have these typographical irritations within the text, because I felt these are irritations that are very close to the irritations in the text that I discuss. These inabilities, these impossibilities that Moshe Yaakov Ben-Gavriêl reflects on in his diaries, that Max Brod has a very weird way of tackling by always transliterating Hebrew. Even his talks till the very end of his life, even his talks were always written down in Latin letters with this very crude transliteration. There was a mixture of Czech phonetics and German phonetics. Only he has this transliteration, and as Michael mentioned, he kind of took it to the extreme in Unambu, in this novel.
By the way, Jabotinsky also, not in the same style, but also transliterated his Hebrew speeches.
Yeah, so there is in the typography, in the letters themselves, there are residues of the strangeness of the Hebrew language, even though it's, as Buba said, the own language, which is kind of foreign, but this is very, very nice part of this lecture. He starts off describing the simultaneity of being close and distant from these both these languages. Yeah.
Just as an afterthought, and you mentioned it in your book, of course, at the end. It is interesting to see if a kind of reverse chapter of Hebrew writing abroad, and you mentioned, of course, the case Ruby Namdar in New York, but also in Berlin. There may be now, and there actually were a few books by now written in Hebrew by Israelis who live in Berlin. Who would have thought that in 1945 or 55? So this is an interesting new chapter of this entanglement.
Yeah, I'm just hinting at it in the very last part of the book as a kind of continuation of thoughts, but also of a certain literary history. if you wish, because there was always this claim that these writers, these German Jewish writers who came from Europe to Palestine and Israel, that they don't have any heirs, any literary heirs. That's a closed chapter. This is one of the big paradigms in existing research. This is done. This is the last chapter of the German Jewish symbiosis. But you can see how they moved into Hebrew literature, for example, as characters. They have a number of examples how these Jecke characters, also German writers, then appear in the novels of Nathan Shacham, for example, or Yoram Kanyuk. And the other one is exactly this re-emergence of a Hebrew diaspora in Berlin, which already existed in the 1920s. You mentioned Uri Zvi Greenberg, and Agnon was in Berlin, and many others were in Berlin in the 20s and the 30s. Lea Goldberg spent time many years in Germany. So these new chapters of Israelis writing in Berlin, writing partly like Mati Shmuelov, writing in Hebrew, and I just read his first novel, Hapras, which is about literary prizes. So it fits perfectly to this whole story of Max Brod receiving the Bialik Prize. And I think the book will be presented here in the Lübeck Institute in November sometime. But also Tomer Gardi, for example, who is an Israeli in Berlin, but he writes in German, but in broken German. So he has a completely different take on this complex constellation, and challenges the German literary establishment by writing books in a language that is not standard, or that is not correct in a way, but it has a great poetic power, and just discussed his most recent novel, which was partly written in broken German, partly in Hebrew, and then translated. It mixes up all the categories. It mixes up all the order that we're used to as literary scholars, also of the book market. So it just doesn't fit. But once you agree to engage with this kind of writing, it opens up a lot of interesting questions and issues. So there is a certain topicality of this, or there's a continuation of this, of these struggles and of these constellations, even in contemporary literature.
Guido would like to say something? No, I'll just say, kind of to sum up the discussion and to connect some of the things that were said. So chapter 5 of your book is really an anthology of German literature written in Hebrew. And I found it interesting, strange and marvelous that kind of a German scholar from Hamburg, from the Exilliteratur, kind of reappropriates the German literature that was written in Israel as part of Hebrew literature, in a sense, back to the German canon. Like some lost tribe was found, of some kind of, suddenly they found in Mexico these Sabbatians that kind of keep the Jewish tradition in secret. So we found this kind of group. And maybe just to sum up, I was wondering, because an anthology in a sense is kind of an attempt to say, if you read anything from the culture, from the 20th century, read this. If you want to know something about Chinese literature, here's an anthology, here's 5 books. Is there something, Dafka, that although you're not into this kind of gesture of saying, hey, you haven't noticed this wonderful is there doch a one text that you think everybody should read, that you found that was kind of forgotten, that you'd recommend, that you think is better than others, that still holds kind of something that, anyway, recommend a reading for us. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Well, of course. it's less the texts that I discuss in this chapter and in the whole book. I mean, they're fascinating and interesting, but they're not always fun to read. Not from the first to the last page. There is, however, a text that I dug up from the archives from the estate of Moshe Yaakov Ben-Gavriêl, and that is his. It was unpublished at the time. I just found the manuscript. It was published in Hebrew translation in 45, I think. Zahav bechutzot, Gold. Jerusalem wird verkauft oder Gold auf der Straße. It's a novel about his experiences as an Austrian officer in World War I in Jerusalem. It was his formative experience. This is why 10 years later, he moved to Palestine, changed his name from Eugen Höflich to Moshe Yaakov Ben-Gavriêl. And about these experiences, being an Austrian officer with the Ottoman forces in Jerusalem, witnessing the suffering of the local population, and the corruption of the European allies. This is something he wrote about again and again and again in different ways. And this novel was completely unknown and unpublished in German. So with the help of Alfred Bodenheimer and Stefan Litt from the National Library, we actually managed to get this published. It came out in 2016. Got a lot of attention because it was 100 years to World War I. So, and this is a text I can definitely recommend, and the Arco Publishing House in Wuppertal will be very grateful if more copies are sold, because this is a text that is good. It is really good, and it's intriguing, and it's a very important contribution and addition to the literature, and especially Jewish literature on World War I, because it focuses on this kind of remote offside battlefield. There was not actually a battlefield because there were no battles, so they just bore themselves day in, day out in this monastery at Ratisbon in Jerusalem. But it's a great novel. It reflects a lot on Zionism, on Orientalism, on pan-Asian ideals, about the unification of all the Asian peoples. And that's apart from a recommendation to read my book. If you read Hebrew, this is a novel I can definitely recommend. It's kind of what was a side project that came up during the research.
Okay. Excellent. So unless we have any more last comments, please help me thank Sebastian Schirmeister for his book, and of course Michael Brenner and Maroquem, Guido Tikwatsky, the Leobeck Institute for hosting us tonight, the Rosenzweig Center. Before we go, two last things. Please come to Jerusalem and drink for small habits. I bid you good night, and I hope to see you soon in Jerusalem.